Today is Christmas Eve in the Russian Orthodox Christian calendar, and no doubt shortly we will be hearing a speech from President Putin to the Russian people commemorating Christmas, and we will see whether or not he declares a Christmas ceasefire in the same way that he did last year. A ceasefire which, it should be said, the Ukrainians did not comply with, and I doubt very much that they will comply with any ceasefire this year either. Nonetheless, and regardless, it is Christmas Eve in the Russian-speaking world, in the Russian Orthodox world, and may I take this opportunity, first and foremost, to wish everybody who celebrates Christmas Eve today and Christmas Day tomorrow a very happy Christmas. What else is going on in the war? Well, there's been actually a fair amount of reports from the battlefronts in Ukraine, and it is to those that I will turn. I should say that we're not getting a comprehensive picture. There's been very little news from the Marinka area, none at all as far as I can see, from Zaporozhye or Kupiansk, which is perhaps unsurprising given, as I said, that it is now Christmas Eve. We are now very close to the Russian Christmas holiday. So it's perhaps unsurprising that we're getting less information. The reporters are probably taking time off from their work, which has been, by the way, incredibly hard and very grueling, and to whom all of us collectively owe a very significant debt for our understanding of the war. But anyway, the effect of this is that we don't have a complete picture of everything that's going on along the battlefronts. We don't know what's going on exactly in the Kupiansk area. We don't know what's going on between Rabotino and Verbovoye. We don't know what's going on in Marinka. That does not, of course, mean that nothing is actually happening in these places. And I think that is an important thing to understand. Quite plausibly, once the Christmas holiday is out of the way, we will get a cascade of reports which will clarify the situation in those parts of the battlefronts. But elsewhere, and perhaps a little surprisingly, we are getting a fair amount of news, and it is interesting and it is revealing. Firstly, in the Avdeyevka area, we are getting quite a lot of reports now about significant Russian losses, advances, not losses, advances in the area of the railway to the northwest of Avdeyevka. The Russians seem to have pushed significantly forward towards Ocheretenye, this village further up the railway, which appears to be a possible destination point of the Russian advance. And there are now significant reports that the Russians have broken through and captured various Ukrainian fortified positions along the railway, and that they're in the process of consolidating control there. Now, that apparently is important in itself for two reasons. Firstly, with this fortified belt having been captured, the Russians can continue their advance along the railway and push on towards Ocheretenye, if that is indeed their plan. But secondly, they also apparently now again have the option to advance westward from the railway. There is apparently open fields now towards a line between the railway and the area of the railway that the Russians have just captured, and a road. And this road is important because it is the road through which the Ukrainians send most of their supplies to the two villages of Stepovoye and Berdichi further south, where an intense encounter battle has been underway for several weeks, with the Russians trying hard to push west from the railway to capture these two villages. And of course, if these two villages are indeed captured, then even according to Ukrainian accounts, the position of the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka itself becomes incredibly precarious. The supply lines reaching them would, in effect, have been cut, and the Ukrainians would either have to beat a very hasty and dangerous retreat or risk finding themselves in a cauldron. So potentially, this is an important advance in the area of the railway. Now, I should say this is a complex battle, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand every aspect of it. The Russian advance, the capture of these fortified positions on the railway, if what we are being told about them is true, is presumably of such significance that it seems likely to me that the Ukrainians over the next couple of days will make a big effort to push the Russians back to try and recapture these fortified positions, or at least perhaps to create new fortified positions to the north and west of this former fortified line. And this has been true of the Battle of Avdeyevka altogether, that the Russians make significant advances. They appear to be on the brink of a breakthrough. The Ukrainians rush troops from various parts of the front lines to plug the gaps. The gaps are plugged, perhaps not fully sealed. The Russians still have managed to make incremental advances and to edge closer to that point where they're going to be able either to cut off Avdeyevka or to seal or to seize the town, to storm the town. But anyway, the Ukrainians have up to now been able to do just enough to keep the situation around Avdeyevka from collapsing. And I would not be surprised if that is precisely what they now again try to do. Whether they will be successful is an entirely different matter. Now, before I finish this discussion of the attack, the Russian attack to the northwest of Avdeyevka, this is also just to say that there's been reports of Russian ballistic missile strikes on Ukrainian positions close to this area. Allegedly, these have used either Russian Iskander-M missiles or these North Korean missiles that Admiral Kirby of the United States has been telling us about, which I discussed in my program yesterday. Whatever it was, apparently there have been missile strikes of that kind, and they have had a very significant effect on Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian base areas behind these front lines. And it could be that the Russians this time are in earnest, having seized these fortified positions. They want to prevent a counterattack from happening. They're attacking using ballistic missiles to attack these concentrations of Ukrainian troops, places where these Ukrainian troops might gather in order to launch a counterattack. So, as I said, a complex battle. It's not always clear precisely what is happening, but it does seem that the Russians are achieving progress. And I'm going to suggest that this is, for the Ukrainians, a particularly dangerous part of the front lines. Now, again, I am heavily reliant on what others have been saying, but if the Russians do manage to cut off supplies completely to Avdeyevka, causing it to become a cauldron, if Avdeyevka itself is stormed, and I'll come to that in a moment because the Russians seem to be making more progress there as well. If, importantly, the Russians are able to push forward and capture this village of Ocheritenye and the other small towns like Keramik, slightly further to the northeast, then it does look as if there is a real potential for a significant collapse of Ukrainian positions in this part of Donbass. The entire Ukrainian defense system in this central area of Donbass begins to look very, very fragile. And the Russians also would potentially have an open route again towards the Dnieper River, if that is what their plan actually is. So this is a dangerous part of the battle lines for the Ukrainians, and that is no doubt why they have been working so hard to try to keep Avdeyevka and have been rushing troops there and have been trying to hold their positions in Avdeyevka, despite General Zaluzhny's admission last week that Avdeyevka is certain to be captured by the Russians at some point within the next 2 to 3 months. Anyway, let's move on to other parts of the front line. If we go further north, there's been less information over the last couple of hours about what is happening in the Bakhmut area. There's been much discussion about Bakhmut in the last couple of days. The Russians do appear to have made very significant advances. They appear to control at least a significant part of Bogdanovka. They have been making more inroads west of Chasov Yar. There's apparently fighting for a cemetery area to the west of Bakhmut. Presumably that is the major cemetery close to Bakhmut. But again, my impression is that having made very significant advances, significant in terms of the heavy fortified positions around Bakhmut. We're not talking about vast sweeps of territory. The Russians have come up against a new set of Ukrainian defense lines ahead of Chasov Yar and the canal, and probably the fighting there. For that reason, the pace of the advances has, for the moment at least, slowed. But it is a different story, somewhat further to the north, in the Liman, Siversk area of the battle lines, where the Russians appear to have made some very significant advances towards this small town. I think it's a bit bigger than a village, called Tyorny. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. There was apparently a Ukrainian counterattack to try to push the Russians back. The Ukrainian forces were caught in the open fields. They were attacked by Russian artillery and drones. There's films circulating of what that looks like. 2 of the tanks were apparently Leopard 2s, which again points to the critical importance of this part of the front line for the Ukrainians. And again, heavy damage seems to have been done to the Ukrainians, and they were pushed back. And the report suggests that the Russians are again in the process of consolidating captured territory and are gradually, slowly pushing forward towards Tierny and seem to be developing simultaneous offensives towards Liman itself and towards Siversk. Now, all of this is going on whilst Ukrainian troops cling on to this bridgehead in Krinky on the Dnieper River, the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. And at the same time, the Ukrainians seem to have been very active over the last couple of days, trying to launch missiles and drones, both towards Crimea itself and beyond Crimea towards Novorossiysk and the Russian ports and bases in the eastern half of the Black Sea. Now, the interesting thing is that the Russians are again claiming that all of these missiles, 4 Storm Shadow missiles launched by Sukhoi 24 aircraft, for example, a Neptune missile, an anti-ship missile tracked over the Black Sea, and all of the drones that have been launched in towards Crimea and Novorossiysk, that they've all been shot down by their air defense forces. Now, I would say that there is one discordant claim. Riba says that one Storm Shadow did manage to get through and reached the Russian airbase at Saki and struck a building there, but that the building was empty and that it did no real damage to the airbase. But that's Riba, that's his account. As I said, officially, the Russians seem to be saying that the entire missile and drone offensive that the Ukrainians have been launching has been a failure. Now, that contrasts with what happened about a week ago when a Ukrainian missile strike managed to strike targets in Feodosia, in Crimea, causing the destruction of a Russian amphibious warfare craft located in Feodosia. So, an air defense system that appeared to be working quite well over the course of the autumn seems to have had this unexplained temporary lapse about 10 days ago, allowing for this destruction of this warship, but now seems to be working efficiently again. Now, I don't have an explanation for this, but I think it is actually possible to make some educated guesses about what has been going on, and it is connected, I think, or perhaps it is, with what is going on in Krinky, this bridgehead that the Ukrainians have on the east bank of the Dnieper River. Now, as some of you may remember, a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians were making claims, about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainians were making claims that their air defense had managed to shoot down several, 5 or more, Sukhoi 34 Russian bombers operating in the Kherson area. And these claims were accepted as true by Riba and largely by Dima at the Military Summary Channel, though I suspect actually he's gradually become more skeptical of these claims. Certainly one Russian Sukhoi 34 was brought down over Kherson region. There's been debate as to how that happened. Some have suggested that it was a friendly fire incident, but the Ukrainians have consistently claimed that they successfully managed to shoot it down. And there were reports in the Ukrainian media and in Ukrainian telegraph channels that the Ukrainian General Staff had deployed a Patriot missile system to Kherson region, and this was a sort of a mobile system that was roaming around the battlefields, and it had ambushed the Russian Air Force there and was responsible for these Russian Air Force losses. And then we started to get some reports from the Russians which at least corroborated some parts of this story, or at least appeared to. Firstly, there were claims in the Russian area of the internet, never made by the Russian Defense Ministry itself, by the way, but anyway, there were these claims, and they do seem to have been true, that a train in Kherson region was attacked by the Russians and destroyed. And there have been reports now that a Patriot missile system, or parts of it, was located on this train, that it was being hurriedly placed on this train so that it could be moved out of Kherson region. And that not only was either the entire or large parts of this Patriot missile system destroyed in this attack, but that many of the operators were killed as well. And there's even a claim that 10 of these operators were Westerners, though I want to stress again that is completely unconfirmed. Anyway, so there was that report about that attack. And around the time when this attack was taking place, it seemed for a period of about 10 days that Russian airstrikes by bombing aircraft, by bombers, principally Sukhoi 34s, on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper River had come to a stop. Now, over the last couple of days, there's been a major resumption of activity by Lancet kamikaze drones striking Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper River. And interestingly, the Russians have provided footage which appears to confirm that these Lancet drones have been successfully destroying Iris-T, German-supplied anti-aircraft missile systems located on the west bank of the Dnieper River. And over the last 2 days or so, Russian bombing of Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper River appears to have resumed. I'm going to try and put all this together. I'm going to try and come to my own conclusion. I want to stress this is entirely my own conclusion. I'm far from sure that this is the case, but it seems to me a reasonable guess as to what perhaps happened. And that is that the Ukrainians did deploy a Patriot missile system to the west bank, to Kherson region, to the west bank of the Dnieper, that they did supplement it with several Iris-T batteries, that the intention perhaps was to provide some degree of air cover to the Ukrainian troops in this bridgehead in Krinky, but also, I suspect, it was to threaten Russian air dominance over Kherson region and over the entire area leading up to Crimea and the eastern part of the Black Sea. And most probably, the Ukrainian Patriot system and the Iris-Ts did succeed in shooting down at least one Sukhoi 34, and that this caused the Russians to stand down some of their air defense systems, their airborne air defense systems. The MiG-31s, which operate in this area, with their very powerful radars that are able to act as kind of AWACS systems, and perhaps also the Beriev A-50U AWACS aircraft that we know that the Russians have been operating increasingly effectively over the entire Ukrainian battlefields. And this created a brief opening which the Ukrainians then used to launch that missile strike on Crimea, the one that managed to get through and hit Feodosia and did that damage to that amphibious warfare ship in the port. Now, what seems to have happened is that the Russians have brought their resources to bear. The Patriot missile system has been either completely destroyed or largely destroyed, or at least it is no longer able to operate in this area because of the overwhelming force of the Russian Lancet drones and other systems that are attacking Ukrainian air defenses on the west bank of the Dnieper. We've seen the Iris-Ts being destroyed. I gather no fewer than 3 systems. This is a significant proportion of the IRIS-T systems that were deployed, that were supplied by Germany to Ukraine. But anyway, 3 of them have been destroyed in this area since the start of January, which is an extraordinarily high number, and there appears to be film and photographic evidence of this. So the result is that Russian bombing strikes on the east or west bank of the Dnieper have now resumed, and Russian air defense systems, MiG-31s and Beriev AWACS aircraft, are again operating, and they're able to track these Ukrainian missiles, the Storm Shadows, when they get launched. And the result is that the Russians are having more success shooting them down. So that's my reconstruction of this. An attempt by Ukraine appears to have been made to change the balance, the balance in terms of air control over the western Black Sea area and in Kherson region, and to open some kind of a route to the Crimea. But it appears to have been ultimately unsuccessful. If this reconstruction that I've given is correct, then this has been a significant failure. One old amphibious warfare ship has been destroyed, but in place of that, the Ukrainians appear to have lost 1 Patriot missile system, probably, and 3 IRIS-T systems, and according to the Russians, 2 of their Sukhoi 24 jets, which launched the Storm Shadows, have also been shot down. So a costly failure. And anyway, we will see what happens. But the long and the short of it is that there's been perhaps some repercussions of this. Earlier today, there was an announcement from Denmark that delivery of F16s has been postponed again, that the number of qualified Ukrainian pilots able to operate these F16s is too small, is too few, that they're not anyway sufficiently qualified to operate them. A few days ago, around the time when we were getting all of those reports about all those Russian jets being shot down, we were hearing reports that the F-16s had already been delivered, that they might even be operating over the Ukrainian skies and might be responsible for the shooting down of those Russian Sukhoi 34s. I never believed that story. And that they were about to enter service with the Ukrainians or with the Ukrainian Air Force, or would do so in April. Suddenly, we're getting reports that their delivery has been postponed for another 6 months. In other words, into the second half of this year. And again, I wonder whether this attempt to create an air defense umbrella on the west bank of the Kherson, of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, might not in some way have been connected with the F-16s, whether it wasn't intended that these air defense systems would provide protection for the F-16s, which would presumably be based in the Odessa area and other locations in the west of Ukraine. And again, with the failure of the attempt to create an air defense system in this part of Ukraine, on the west bank of the Dnieper, deployment of the F-16s, again, is judged as unsafe, and a decision has been made to postpone their deployment. Now, let me stress again, this is all my surmise. Anybody who wishes is happy to pick holes in it. I'm not an expert in these matters, but one gets all of this information, comes together. It does beg some interesting questions about what exactly has been going on. And anyway, one way or the other, it does seem to me as if some sort of face-off has been happening along the Dnieper, but that the Russians, on the basis of the information that we're now seeing, the resumption of bombing on Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and the Lancet strikes on Ukrainian air defense positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, that the Russians, for the moment at least, are back with gaining the advantage. Now, where does all that leave the Ukrainian soldiers in Krinky? Yesterday, I spoke about another article in the Washington Post giving a very bleak assessment of the situation of these soldiers in Krinky. Notice that the earlier articles that had appeared say much the same thing about how bad the situation of the soldiers in Krinky was. All were written, in places like the New York Times, the BBC, the Kiev Independent some weeks ago. Maybe there was a brief hope that with the deployment of the Patriots and the Iris-Ts to the west bank of the Dnieper, the situation in Krinky would improve. But yesterday, following the destruction and or pullback of Ukrainian air defense assets, we get another article from the Washington Post this time, again telling us about how grave the situation for the Ukrainian troops in Krinky has become. By the way, on that topic, a couple of weeks ago, there were lots of reports, as I remember, including from Riba, about how it become easier to supply these troops in Krinky once the Dnieper in this area iced over, and that the Ukrainians would be able to send supplies and men to Krinky across the ice. I expressed deep skepticism about this, based to some extent on my own experiences as a walker. Though I want to stress again what I've said previously, I have never walked over ice and have no intention of ever doing so. I regard it as I consider it to be an extremely dangerous thing to do, and I have always been warned against doing it. And I ought to say that after I made that observation, I got a long flurry of pieces from all sorts of extremely helpful people who have in fact walked on ice, who engage in ice fishing, for example, which I know is a very interesting and sport and activity that people carry out, places like Canada and other places. Anyway, they all basically said the same thing, that sending large numbers of men and supplies, presumably in the dark, across an icy river is an extremely foolhardy and unwise thing to do. One only walks over ice in very, very controlled circumstances and engages in ice fishing in very, very controlled circumstances. And obviously that isn't what was being discussed here. Anyway, suffice to say, I've now seen pictures, what appear to be contemporary pictures of the Dnieper in the Krinky area. And I should say that the landscape is snow-covered. There seems to have been more snowfalls. But I have to also say, from what I could see, the Dnieper has not frozen over. So maybe the whole theory, the whole concept of a frozen over Dnieper that you could send men and supplies over to Krinky is a flawed one right from the outset. My understanding is that the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Krinky is now absolutely desperate. The bridgehead has been shrunk and is now extremely small. Ukraine is continuing to try to send boats, mostly now with supplies, to try to keep these men supplied with some kind of equipment. A couple of weeks ago, the Russians were reporting that any Ukrainian troops they captured in this area had, without exception, were suffering from frostbite, which does not surprise me. My own view, and I'd say this straightforwardly, is that Ukraine should write this whole operation off. If it cannot withdraw these troops from Krinky, which is possible, apparently the Russians now routinely operate drones and carry out strikes on boats on the Dnieper. And some weeks ago, I was explaining how they've developed infrared, or rather not infrared, but night vision devices for their drones, so that they're able to track the movement of boats on the Dnieper. If these people cannot be withdrawn from Krinky, then the only humane and rational thing to do is to allow them to surrender to the Russians rather than to throw away their lives. However, I don't expect that that is what Ukraine is going to do. Now, this rather lengthy, uncharacteristically lengthy from me, account of the situation on the battlefronts precedes another brief mention about the effect of the airstrikes, the Russian missile strikes, I should say, on Kiev, the two huge, devastating strikes that took place on the 29th of December and on the 3rd of January. And despite efforts by Ukraine to try to restrict film of these airstrikes, missile strikes, more and more of it is now pouring out. And again, I have to make a number of comments about this. I am not, as I've said many times, the best person to assess pictures or films of events. I've issues with vision. But I think what I am seeing, and all of this must be coming from Ukrainian sources, is clear enough. Skies over Kiev during these strikes have red glows. You can see huge flashes, which are clearly the results of missiles impacting. Major explosions, and again, these are not explosions of missiles that have been shot down. These are clearly impact explosions. And no real indication that the air defense system over Kiev is operating at all. At some point over the course of the missile strike on the 3rd of January, it appears to have essentially collapsed. Now, there must be some explanation for this. I don't pretend to know what it is. Perhaps the simultaneous hacking that the Russians were carrying out of the mobile phone system is only a part of the cyber attacks that the Russians might have been undertaking. Maybe they carried out a massive cyber attack of the Ukraine's air defense system. I mean, I don't know. Or maybe it could be that the KH-31s knocked out the radars, or it could be something else that I am completely unaware of. But anyway, there does seem to have been a point over the course of that second attack on the 3rd of January when the entire system seems to have broken down. And I get the sense that not only did half of the missiles manage to get through and hit their target, but beyond a certain point, missiles were simply streaking across the sky and hitting their targets, and no real attempt was being made by anyone in Kiev any longer to shoot anything down. So far from the Ukrainians successfully shooting down all the Kinzhals and all the KH-101s and all of those, it does seem to me, again, this is I accept my impression, but it is one that more and more people are coming to, including Ukrainians. It seems that not only was this a devastating strike, but that it exposed what is in effect the collapse of the air defense system in Kiev. And I also get the sense that this is now having a major effect on Western thinking and Western planning. Now, someone has done, and I've seen the tables, an assessment of where most Western NATO air defense systems are located in the general European area. And they worked out that around a third of them are located in Ukraine, with a very high proportion of them located in and around Kiev itself. I think a third is a bit too high. I would put it at between a quarter and a third myself, but never mind. It does seem as if a very large concentration of Western air defense assets, missiles and things, are indeed located in Ukraine and specifically around Kiev. And it does seem as if some of the best radars and the most advanced systems are indeed located there. And this whole thing, this whole structure has collapsed after a number of Russian missile strikes. It cannot cope with the hypersonic missiles and the various other systems that the Russians have developed. And I think this is causing a shock. And we had that panicky announcement from the European Union that they were going to try and find 1,000 Patriot missiles, interceptors, which, as I said, I think is a fantastic, heroic assumption for the Europeans to make, and that they were going to set up production lines in Europe to produce these things, which would take years to do. But more importantly, today in the New York Times, I see a report. It speaks for itself. Ukraine's Patriot defenses at work, shuddering booms and bursts of light. The American-provided air defense systems have helped Ukraine defend itself against Russian assaults, but Washington has warned that it will not be able to keep them supplied for much longer. And of course, all of this is explained by the fact that there's been this block in Congress of further funding for Ukraine. But again, I wonder whether that is really true, and whether, in fact, the true reason why Patriot missiles are not being supplied to Ukraine is partly because Patriot missiles are, generally speaking, anyway, in short supply. Brian Beletic has been discussing this over the course of many programs, but also that the Patriot missile systems, for all the fact that they've been supplemented, according to the source I received, with Iron Dome radars from Israel, are not working effectively anymore. The Russians can bypass them, and they're actually successfully destroying them. Perhaps a whole system destroyed in Kherson region. Damage, even the US acknowledges the damage was done to one system in Kiev in the strike of the 29th of December. Reports that more damage was done over the course of the even more powerful strike that took place on the 3rd of January. And that, of course, if that continues, if there is indeed a reduction in air defense systems, Patriot missile systems, and if the IRIS-T system proves as ineffectual as it's turning out to be, and the NASAM system as well, the Norwegian supplied one as well. And by the way, Norway has joined France in saying that it too is not going to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons. They're going to try instead to build up Ukraine's military industrial complex, which is an absurd idea. But anyway, if this is all happening, then of course it is a further cause to doubt Ukraine's prospects, because Ukraine's previous Soviet provided air defense system based on the S-300 effectively collapsed last year following the Russian missile offensive against Ukraine's energy system. And it seems that this Western supplied system that has taken its place has now fallen far short, and its fragility has been exposed. Now, before I continue, I would point out that several people, Brian Beletic again being prominent amongst them, but many others also, myself also to a certain extent, also previously had pointed out that this Western supplied system with all its missiles, its Patriot missiles and NASAMS missiles and its NASAMS and IRIS-Ts and all the rest, that it was not really a proper substitute for the system that Ukraine started the war with based around the S-300. But anyway, whatever. The fact is, it doesn't seem to be working very well. And we saw over the course of 2023, the Russian Air Force, which after a certain presence in Ukrainian skies in the early weeks of the war, had largely withdrawn from the scene in the summer and autumn of 2022. But we saw over the course of 2023, the Russian Air Force begin to become increasingly active. They're launching precision-guided bombs in increasing numbers in places around Ukraine, causing increasing amount of damage. That was largely a product of the collapse of Ukraine's original S-300 based air defense system. And if the current Western supplied air defense system is also collapsing, and if the United States really does decide that it cannot go on supplying Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine because of the enormous damage that the Russians are able to do to them, and because the weaknesses of this system are becoming increasingly exposed, then we will no doubt see the Russian Air Force, which is increasing in size and being supplied with more and more precision-guided aerial bombs, become more active still. Now, here I would like to turn briefly to a piece of historical rewriting about this conflict that is now busily underway. I noticed that General Petraeus, he who was for a time the head of the CIA and who is a well-known general of strong neocon views in the United States, and General Ben Hodges and various others are now coming up with an explanation for the failure of Ukraine's summer offensive, the one which they confidently expected would be an overwhelming success. And Petraeus, at least, is now saying that the reason the offensive failed was because, as General Zaluzhny has also been saying, Ukraine was not supplied with enough aircraft to gain air superiority, and that NATO would never launch an offensive of this kind without overwhelming air superiority. Now, there is some truth in this, and there were a few people before the offensive pointing out that with Ukraine lacking air superiority, that would make the whole idea of the offensive problematic. But what people like Petraeus and Ben Hodges and others who talk in this way never mention is that at the time when the summer offensive was, well, the plans for it crystallized in the winter of 2022, 2023. At that time, the Russian Air Force had been largely written off. I remember reading all kinds of articles right through 2022 talking about the fact that the Russian Air Force had been exposed as a paper tiger, that the fact that it wasn't operating showed that it had been hugely overrated. There was some debate as to why the Russians weren't committing their Air Force to the battle in the way that NATO might have done. And I suspect that the reason NATO planners and American planners and Ukrainians themselves probably decided that they would go into battle in the summer, despite the fact that they didn't have clear-cut air superiority over the Russians, was because they didn't think they would need it, because at that time they'd all internalized all of those claims that the Russian Air Force was a joke or was absent from the battlefields or had gone absent without leave and whatever, that it didn't need to be taken particularly seriously. Of course, just as the Russians spent the winter of 2022-2023 weakening the Ukrainian air defense system through their missile strikes, and also spent the winter of 2022-2023 building their huge defenses on the eastern and southern front lines. Well, by doing those things, they were actually putting themselves in a stronger position to deal with the offensive. The fortifications would deal with the tanks and the infantry and the armor that the West was supplying. And the missile strikes on Ukraine in the winter would weaken the air defense system, Ukraine's air defense system, to the point where the Russian Air Force would be able to begin to operate in an effective way. And from the summer, that, of course, is precisely what it did. So I just want to challenge that piece of rewriting. When people say that NATO would not have conducted such an offensive without air superiority, they are, of course, correct. That doesn't change the fact that they acted, the Western powers and Ukraine acted in the way that they did, based upon false assessments of Russian capabilities. And the reason those assessments of Russian capabilities turned out to be wrong was because the Russians themselves took steps to make sure that they would prove to be wrong. I would add that to think that the West could supply aircraft to Ukraine in sufficient quantity to wrest control of the sky from the Russian Air Force, given that Russia is, if not a superpower on the scale of the United States, certainly one of the great military powers in the world, Well, that is a very tall order indeed. It would require hundreds, probably thousands of the most advanced fighter jets and pilots, and in order to achieve it, and even then, it might not have been possible. And for Petraeus to say now that the offensive failed because Ukraine did not have air superiority is basically to say that the offensive should never have taken place at all. It was clearly misconceived right from the outset. Anyway, I wanted to make these points because all of this, again, brings us back to this perennial issue of where is this war going. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been a whole succession of reports, apparently originating in London, that the British assess that a major Russian offensive is about to be unleashed on Ukraine from the 15th of January. There was an article to this effect in the Daily Telegraph, and there is also reports about it in the various Ukrainian Telegram channels, saying that the Ukrainian government has been given advice by MI6 that this great Russian offensive is coming and is about to be launched on the 15th of January. Now, there are differences. An article in the Daily Telegraph, the article in the Daily Telegraph says that it will be launched from the north towards Kharkiv, that the area of attack will be the old one of Sumy and Chernigov. The Ukrainians have apparently been told to strengthen their defense lines in this area, to build more minefields and concrete positions, and dragon's teeth and all of that. That, as Dima at the Military Summary channel correctly said, how they're supposed to do all of that by the 15th of January is not explained. But anyway, that's one claim. Another claim is made by one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels. I think it was Resident. I always get Resident and Legitimate mixed up. But they say that MI6 has actually warned the Ukrainians that, yes, there is going to be a big Russian offensive on the 15th of January, but the attack on Kharkiv region will not be the main focus of the attack. The attack will be dispersed around many front lines, and one shouldn't assume that because large Russian forces are pushing from the north, from Kharkiv region, that the Russians might not be attacking in other places too. Is any of this true? Now, the British have given warnings like this many times, and a point which is perhaps not well noticed, but I have noticed this, is that the British actually, you get this sense also from Ministry of Defence briefings, are not, in fact, especially well informed about what the Russians are going to do, and that many of their assessments, in fact, most of their assessments, have turned out to be consistently wrong. And I am going to say that any attempt to try to second guess the Russians and what they're planning is a very risky undertaking indeed. Now, in various programs, I have discussed this entity, Stavka, or rather concept that the Russians have, their high command. And I've also said that John Helmer is, in my experience, one of the most sophisticated and intelligent, in fact, perhaps the best person to understand what Stavka is. And I found on his website, Dancing with Bears, very, very interesting article written, I believe, by Helmer in 2014, or rather, no, not 2014, more like 2016 maybe. But anyway, some time ago, in which he discusses Stavka and the way Stavka operates and gives us some insight as to what actually it is. And of course, he makes the point, first of all, that in fact, officially, if you go to the organization charts of the Russian Ministry of Defense, you will not find any reference to any entity called Stavka there. Strangely enough, Stavka does exist in Ukraine. Zelensky, who claims to be so hostile to everything Russian, has imitated the Russians by calling his own military command Stavka, in imitation of the Russians. But in theory, at least, there is no actual body in Russia called Stavka. And in fact, Helmer actually says as much. He says that officially there is no Stavka today. The Security Council, which is a political body, by the way, which convenes roughly every week with the defense minister in attendance, but no military officers, is not Stavka. But then Helmer goes on to say what is known of the headquarters command, the collective known as Stavka, started in the 19th century when inside the battlefield tent is essentially a translation of the word Stavka, as the original Russian term referred, was the field general, his principal unit commanders, and staff advisors. And then Helmer goes on to say the Stavka during the Second World War was the 10 to 20 man group Stalin trusted most. It was the final headquarters which took in intelligence, appraised situations, decided strategy, ordered operations, coordinated forces, fronts, armies. The officers dispatched by Stavka to supervise each of the war directions were marshals, so they outranked the commanders of the line. And I think that you can speak of the Russian High Command constructed around the General Staff, headed by General Gerasimov, the overall Russian commander of the forces fighting in Ukraine, whose reports of whose death yesterday, which had appeared in the Polish media, have now been found to be premature. No less a person than Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, has refuted them. Anyway, the combined political, military, intelligence leadership, the people who come together, perhaps around 20 people in total, 20, perhaps more than that, they are the people who make the overall decisions as to how the war is conducted. And one of the most interesting things that Helmer makes in this article is about the great secrecy within which these people tend to work and their efforts to try to keep things as secret, their intentions and their actions, as secret as possible. And he speaks about how offensive strategies for offense to succeed, intelligence on the enemy's readiness, vulnerabilities must be good, counterintelligence, concealment of preparations, deception, maskirovka are all required. And the secrecy extends to the commanders themselves. The people who are in charge tend to say as little as possible. And again, he speaks about the way in which Marshal Zhukov, the deputy head of Stavka during the Second World War, there was some concern at the time that he was drawing too much attention to himself, and that today military officers, people like Gerasimov, tend to say as little as possible and tend to keep their counsel secret. And I have previously mentioned the fact that we know incredibly little about Gerasimov and about his thinking in terms of his overall visibility in terms of the war. He is practically an invisible man. Well, trying to guess what these people are going to do is incredibly difficult. And going back to claims that are regularly made that there is no surprise in this war, I'm going to suggest that, in fact, the Russians have been taking the world by surprise consistently. It was taken for granted back in February and March, for example, that their objective was to capture Kiev. And they sent troops to Kiev, and it turned that they weren't going to try and capture Kiev. Then in the autumn, there was wide expectations that they would try to defend Kherson city to the bitter end, and they didn't defend Kherson city to the bitter end, and they were able to pull their troops out of Kherson city, and the West and the Ukrainians were taken completely by surprise by a withdrawal they neither expected nor properly noticed whilst it was being executed. And then, of course, the Russians did succeed in withstanding Ukraine's offensive of the summer, but again, nobody really predicted that they would go on the attack in the autumn, attacking places like Avdeyevka and Bakhmut and such places, and that they would continue their offensive through the Rasputitsa. And no one knows what overall tactics and overall Russian strategy are. There's assumptions, for example, that they're going to attack the energy system this winter. Instead, we see that they're attacking with their missiles in other places. They have proved actually surprisingly skilled at keeping everybody guessing about what it is that they're going to do. So maybe there will be a Russian offensive on the 15th of January, but personally, I would not be surprised if there is no such great offensive. If instead the Russians simply do what they have been doing successfully now for most of the last few months, since the Ukrainian offensive basically exhausted itself at the end of October, which is continued to exert mounting pressure on Ukraine in every part of the front line, continue attrition, wearing the Ukrainians down, eroding their air defense system, bombing Ukrainian locations, increasing the pressure until eventually the Ukrainians either crack or are weakened to such a degree that the Russian forces, which are growing in strength all the time, are finally ready and are to be unleashed on the offensive, which, when it comes, will probably be the final knockout blow. And I would say again that just as military strategy, Russian military strategy, is not always easy to second guess, the same is true of political strategy. We don't know exactly where the Russians intend to stop, whether they do intend to take Kiev, whether they intend to advance all the way to the Polish border, what they're going to do with Galicia, all of these things, we can guess, we can speculate about it, but having people from MI6 giving advice to the Ukrainians about what the Russians intend to do on any particular day, I think that is bad advice, and I think we should take it with great care. So, there we go. That seems to me to be the overall state of the war at the moment. Now, Gordon Hahn, who is one of the most insightful commentators discussing the conflict in Ukraine, and who keeps a very careful eye on what is going on in Kiev itself, says that the situation in Kiev and in Ukraine in general is becoming critical, that the political divisions there are now becoming acute, that we saw this in this astonishing confrontation between Zelensky and the parliamentarians that I talked about yesterday. And, well, there could be a major political crisis in Kiev at any time. And perhaps there will be. I said also yesterday in my program that I now have what I am confident is reasonably reliable information about the outreaches that certain prominent Ukrainian individuals have carried out to the Russians. I said that I know who these individuals are, and I also know, by the way, who their Russian interlocutors were. So maybe things like that are starting to happen and are starting to move. But one way or the other, I do think that the pressure from the Russians is going to grow. The dismay in the West is going to intensify. The hardliners in Washington, unwilling to give up on their enterprise, are looking for further means of escalation, seizing Russian reserves, perhaps supplying long-range missiles to Kiev as well. Well, all of that. But the overall direction, the trajectory of events now is clear. What is the West going to do? What is the government in Kiev going to do in the face of all of this? Coming up with ideas of sending, as I said, more missiles, cutting back on military aid, talking about building up military industrial facilities in Ukraine. All of that is now words. It is not going to change the overall trajectory of the situation, nor are we going to see any fundamental change, so it seems to me, in the general geopolitical situation. As the war grinds on, I expect Russian alliances and Russian strategic partnerships to remain solid, nor is the Russian economy going to collapse. I am increasingly coming to the view that even as the hardliners in Washington continue to remain in control and continue to push their dangerous agendas in Ukraine and in the Middle East, the political focus, both in Washington and to some extent in Europe, is now veering hard towards what is going to happen in the election in the United States. And I suspect that this is soon going to become not just as the all-consuming issue politically, but for many people almost, the existential issue. I'm going to say briefly this. I am becoming very alarmed indeed about some of the commentaries that I'm starting to see in sections of the media, both in the United States, but especially in Britain, about what the effects of certain outcomes of the election in the United States might be. If one were to take this talk seriously, then what is at stake in the election is existential, not just for the United States, but for the West, for democracy, for the entire liberal capitalist order. I'm deeply skeptical whether the participants in the election, and I'm choosing my words now extremely carefully, have anything like the kind of plans that are being attributed to them by some of the people in the media, or have the political beliefs that are attributed to them also. But a sense of crisis is being created around the United States itself, which I fear is going to cause instability in that country and is going to make coherent decision-making on foreign policy issues never a strong point in any US government, and an extremely weak point in this particular one, all but impossible. I would not be surprised to see if a collapse comes in Ukraine and a crisis takes hold in the Middle East, whilst the focus of people in Washington remains elsewhere, directed single-mindedly at the person who is likely to win the Republican nomination in a few weeks' time. Anyway, we shall see. More from me soon. This is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please remember that you can also check out our shop and get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.